Just a quick note before we get going. We'll start in a few minutes, but if anybody needs a hearing assistance device, Tom has some in the back there. So we'll give people about 5 minutes, another 3-4 minutes, and then we'll get started. So.
Your bag and your
Oh.
measurements, so sometime you and I can talk. I took pictures of the
All right, we'll go ahead and get started here because given that it's Minnesota and we're in, what is it, El Nino or La Nina winter, and we're I think in the top 10 of all snowiest winters so far, and there's more snow forecast for the end of the week, so anyhow, so we'll try and get this wrapped up in an hour, although those of you who know me, and if I tell you an hour for a presentation, you put a Huschke factor on it, and it's probably going to be a little over that. So, but given that the roads are bad, we'll probably try and squeeze it in. And if you need to go, I won't feel bad if you have to get up and leave. My son has already informed me that he's leaving early. So, what's family for? Anyhow. All right. Well, thank you. And I just wanted to say thanks to Father Andre for giving me this opportunity to share something with you. And I've been on, I think, 2 pilgrimages in the last month now. There was a group of us that went to the Holy Land, and that was absolutely amazing. It's going to take me a while to totally unpack all that, but the second pilgrimage that I've been on has been putting this presentation together, because when you dive into these things and you see how fantastic our faith is, or how God is, and how he acts in space and time, anyhow, this has been another pilgrimage for me putting this together. So thank you, Father Andre. And also, I think it's a little bit of penance. I think it might be for a reconciliation session to come yet, but anyhow. So I don't know if I get early credit here, but anyhow. All right. So the topic tonight is Our Lady of Guadalupe, and it's part of the Lenten series here at St. Therese. In the past, we've talked about Shroud of Turin and angels. And this one, when I talked to Father Andre about it, on the surface is very similar to the Shroud of Turin in that it's a miraculous occurrence or an artifact that we can touch and feel and see a long time after it was created. But in many ways, it's very different than the Shroud of Turin, and that's what has made it so much fun for me to kind of dig into this and put it together. So anyhow, an hour is a very short time to get through this, so without further ado, this is just kind of our agenda for tonight. So the times, well, I'll try and stay to those. That was more for me just to kind of know how much time I had in each section, but we'll do an opening prayer. I've got some introductory thoughts kind of to get some things in your head as we go along. We'll talk about the tilma then just very briefly, which is the cape that Juan Diego had, and that really is kind of at the core of all of this. We'll talk about the history because the context is really important for this, because it helps us or allows us to really kind of look at some parallels between 1530, 1531 and now, which I think is where a huge part of the value of this is in looking at what happened then and what, it tells us about now. There's a very interesting story that goes with how the tilma came to be, and I really had to squeeze that down. So what I would say to you is that if you get a chance, go online, read more about it, or get a book. There's a couple books that I was using for research on this that are at the table over here with Dan and Jennifer. I don't know if you want to pass those around or something, people can kind of look at them, but read about the story because it's very fascinating. Then we'll talk about the tilma itself, the artifact, and kind of all the cool things that are in that. And then there's a science of it. So there's a message in the tilma, or messages, and then there's a science. There's the scientists have had their swing at this, and then there's what they've learned about it, which they learned even more than what was in the symbolism of that the Spanish and the Aztecs got out of it at the time. So, and then some closing thoughts. Just what does this mean to us now? So anyhow, and as far as questions go, since we're trying to keep this crunch down, if you can hold them to the end, if there's something absolutely burning, then we can talk about it. But as my family knows, if I start answering questions and it goes bzzz, off into la la land. So anyhow, all right. Does that sound good? All right, beautiful. As far as an opening prayer goes, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Holy Spirit, be present to us this evening as we celebrate the miracle of the apparition of Mary to Juan Diego, known as Our Lady of Guadalupe. We thank you for the opportunity to assemble and to grow in our sense of community and faith, and to appreciate how you have intervened in time and space with messages of your care for us. Help each of us discover pieces missing from our picture of your incredible creation, and make clear the next steps on our faith journey. We ask this in your name. Amen. Saint Therese, pray for us. All right. I didn't give Father Andre a chance. I don't know if you wanted to add a prayer on top of that, or okay. All right. So I'm going to. Yesterday, Tom and I came and looked at the text font size that I had, and it was too small, so I had to rework all my slides between yesterday and today. Most of the font was that size, so anyhow, I'm going to read this one to you, and this is Mary talking to Juan Diego the first time she appeared to him. So it kind of sets, I think, the stage for the rest of the story. She says, "Know for certain that I am the perfect and perpetual Virgin Mary, Mother of the true God. Here I will show and offer all my love, my compassion, my help and protection to the people. I am your merciful mother, the mother of all who love me, of those who cry to me, of those who have confidence in me. Here I will hear their weeping and their sorrows, their necessities and misfortunes. Listen and let it penetrate your heart. Do not be troubled or weighed down with grief. Do not fear any illness or vexation, anxiety or pain. Am I not here who am your mother? Are you not under my shadow and protection? Am I not your fountain of life? Are you not in the folds of my mantle, in the crossing of my arms? Is there anything else you need?" And that was her words to him spoken on December 9th, and then she also said the same thing to him in another time she appeared to him on the 12th of December. And what she was doing was requesting him to go to the bishop and ask to have a temple or a shrine built to her in this location. And he was kind of a nobody, and so he was not thinking he was going to have much success in talking to the bishop about having this done. So anyhow, so this was her responding to him having doubts. And then just by way of introductory comments, one of the things in this, and that's kind of what I was just mentioning, is that, who God uses to convey these messages to us. And as we all know, it's not the powerful and it's not the rich. It's always, the poor and, the marginalized who seem to get the tap on the shoulder to go answer. And some of the questions, Juan obviously is on the list, but if you look back through history, Abraham, David, Jesus himself, the apostles, if you look at some more recent Marian apparitions, there's Fatima, which is the 3 shepherd children who were, between like 6 and 10 or something. And then, Bernadette Subaru with Lourdes. So anyhow, so that's one thing you'll see in this Juan Diego, that he fits that pattern very well. And one thing I couldn't resist with this, but, if you look at this story, it could be an epic novel. Fiction novel, and the critics' reviews would probably run something like an epic tale spanning continents and millennia, a gripping tale of redemption at the intersection of myth and reality. Millions of lives changed through an unlikely hero's obedience and purity of heart. A miracle in time saves 9 million. Sorry about that one, I couldn't resist. 5 days that changed the world. So anyhow, the story really reads like, if you guys remember the TV series 24, like every hour was, 24 hours was like jam-packed. Well, that's this, except it's stretched over 5 days, so it'd have to be, something other than 24, but anyhow. Okay, so those are the introductory comments. Let's jump into the tilma. So the tilma, it's basically a cape that was worn by poor people, and it wasn't just poor people, but you could tell a person's status by the way this outer cape looked, and for somebody who was of the lower class, actually Juan was the middle class, but he was extremely poor, but it was not only an article of clothing, but it was also functional. You could carry things in it. So his cape, the way it hangs down in front, you could, if you wanted to carry vegetables in from the garden or something, you could load them in there and walk back to the house with them. But anyhow, and at the time they were made from this agave cactus, which took a lot of processing of these cactuses, but it was very labor intensive, but the fabric was woven from that. But this original tilma, his tilma still exists. And it's on display at the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City, which is the most visited Christian shrine in the world, which when I heard that, it surprised me a little bit, but it's even more than Lourdes or Fatima or any of the what you kind of think of as the big ones. But, and on it, so when you look at this picture, it's kind of an attractive picture. But it has numerous symbols, significant, and it turns out that to the Aztecs, it had an incredible amount of meaning, based on they had a codex, which was kind of a language, or it wasn't so much a language, but it was a way of conveying meaning and recording events. And the tilma, it turns out, had a whole bunch of information encoded in it, and we'll go through some of the details of what that is. And then also for Christians, the way it lays out is very familiar to people who are iconographers. So it's got a lot of characteristics of a Christian icon. So it was kind of it had a foot in both worlds as far as the Aztec culture and then the Christian culture. And this will be significant in terms of the story, in terms of the conversion of all these Indians in Mexico. And it was the basis for the conversion of the 9 million people. It was miraculously formed, and at the time it kind of gobsmacked the bishop who was in Mexico at the time, this Bishop Zumarga. I was talking to our helper, our seminarian, Martin Chenard. He actually was at the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe just this winter, and he was there and talking to people, and he gave me the proper pronunciation of that, so Zumarga. Anyhow, so it has numerous symbols. It's the basis for the conversion. The size of it is, it's from top to bottom, it's about 76 inches and it's 41 inches wide. And this is actually, it was cut down a little bit from what its original size was. It's 2 lengths of fabric sewn together, so there's a seam down the middle that you can kind of see there. This fabric is of fibers from the agave cactus, as we mentioned. And the normal lifespan of this fiber is about 20 years. So if you just made a tilma of this and set it on the shelf and came back 20 years later, it would basically fall apart. But the tilma with the image on it is 492 years old, and it's still like new. And that's part of the mystery of it. And then for the first 115 years that it was in existence, it actually hung in this chapel on Tepeyac Hill. And it was not air-conditioned, it was damp, and there were smoky candles in there, and pilgrims came and touched it. You know, it's like when we went to the Holy Land and everybody wanted to touch their rosary to Golgotha, or, you know, at the Church of the Nativity, the spot where, you know, Christ was born. And so you can imagine a piece of fabric with, you know, thousands of people touching their dirty hands to it, and all kinds of articles, everything from swords to helmets to stuff. So, and it doesn't show anywhere after all of that. The other thing, a couple other things happened. In 1791, by then it was in a bigger church, and it was inside of a frame that was made out of gold and silver, and somebody was cleaning the frame, and they spilled concentrated nitric acid on it, and it ended up, oops, there's my laser, there it is. Up in the corner here, you can kind of see a little watermark. That's the only indication that this nitric acid was spilled on it. It should have destroyed it. And then in 1921, there were some partisans in Mexico. There was some unrest, and they didn't like the fact that the Catholics had this icon, so they were going to blow it up. So somebody put 29 sticks of dynamite in a vase, a flower vase in front of the altar, and it blew up, and it blew out all the windows in the church, destroyed the altar, and then that cross, that's a big crucifix that's in that picture down below there, that crucifix was just warped. It was bent like it was, you know, a piece of plastic. But the tilma was untouched. It was in this frame and glass over it, but the tilma was, you know, the glass wasn't even cracked in front of it. So anyhow, somebody was looking out for that picture. Actually, I got to go back here. So that gives you just kind of a brief intro to the tilma. Let's talk about the history a little bit. So the history of this is where you could really spend a lot of time, and I probably did more than I should have, but anyhow. So 1398, there was a gentleman who's kind of the founder of the Aztec Empire, Tlalocal. Some of these Nahuatl words I stumble on a bit. But anyhow, he was born in 1398, and then essentially he was a man behind the scenes. He didn't want to be the ruler, but he pulled the strings behind the scenes, and then he was the one who really led to the founding of the Aztec Empire, and that basically became a thing in 1429. 1492, everybody knows that year, Europeans came in contact with South and Central Americans, and that was significant because disease came in and wiped out, I think they thought there were like 27 million indigenous people in Central and South America, and after the diseases had gone through, I think there were, you know, it was more on the order of 15 million, so a lot of people were killed because of that. Hernan Cortez arrived in 1519, and then 2 years later, the Aztec capital, that Tenochtitlan, fell to the Spaniards. And even though they were vastly outnumbered, and Hernan Cortez immediately requested that Franciscan friars be sent over because he wanted to evangelize the natives. So he asked Franciscans to come over and start that process. 4 years later, this Bishop Zumarraga arrives in Mexico, and it turns out he was sent by King Charles V with a very specific mission. Things were getting kind of ugly in the Mexico based on the way the conquistadors were interacting with the natives. And by 1531, things had gotten pretty rough. And it was one of the authors that I read is that everybody was fighting everybody because the Franciscans were advocating for the Indians, and the Spaniards were fighting against the Indians and the Franciscans. And so it was just chaos. But then to take a little bit of a step back, so what part of the reason that the Spaniards were so down on the indigenous folks was what had been happening. When they arrived, they found these temples where there was basically bloody sacrifice was a regular thing. The Aztecs believed they needed to do that to certain gods to basically make sure the sun came up every day. And if the sun god didn't get his proper amount of blood, he wouldn't come up. So that worked out to about 25,000 people a year were being sacrificed. And generally, the Aztecs, they had what they would call these flower wars. So there were other tribes around that weren't necessarily hostile, but they would declare war on them. They wouldn't kill anybody, but they would take hostages, bring them back, and then that would become the fodder for their sacrifices. And they didn't just rip their hearts out. They had some other creative ways to sacrifice people, and then they also were cannibals. So the warriors and the elites in the society got to partake of the spoils in terms of dinner, but the lowest class were mostly it was agrarian, so they ate fruits and vegetables, and I guess corn was one of the other main things that a staple that they had. And there was one year where they decided they needed to consecrate this new temple that they had just built, and so they sacrificed 80,000. They don't know the exact number, but they think it was somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people were killed, were basically had their hearts ripped out in one 4-day period in 1487. So when the conquistadors arrived, that's how they viewed the indigenous people. They looked at them as, these people are beyond redemption. And a lot of those folks had been fighting in Spain, that 600-year war against the Muslims in Spain. So they basically had cut their teeth. They had grown up in war, and the only way to I guess get things your way was to basically put them to the sword. So so that was kind of what a lot of the conquistadors had in mind. So there was the emperor at the time. There were some Aztec prophecies, and there were things that were starting to happen that he was seeing that were lining up with these prophecies that were essentially indicating it was the end of an era. There were 5 different eras for the Aztecs, and they were, somewhere knew they were coming to the end of the 4th era, and they were going to enter into the 5th era. And the hallmarks of the 5th era is that it was going to be a time of peace and prosperity and an end to human sacrifice. So this Montezuma was starting to get worried because he was seeing some of these signs were starting to happen. And one of the signs was a comet, and it turned out that Halley's Comet showed up in 1519. So he had seen Halley's Comet in addition to these other things, and so he was already nervous that his days were numbered. So this Aztec prophecy involved this prophet called Quetzalcoatl, and it turned out there was also a god that was called Quetzalcoatl who was brutal. This prophet was somebody who had been thrown out of South America or Central America, but the prophecy was that he was going to come back someday and come back from the east. And they actually had a very specific date that they had predicted that he was going to come back on. And when he came back, it was going to bring this end to human sacrifice and an era of peace. And that date was April 22nd of 1519. Cortez, his arrival kind of eerily fulfills these Aztec prophecies. Any guess as to when he showed up? April 22nd, 1519. And if we talked about all the things that were in these prophecies, like one of the things that was in the prophecy was that this Quetzalcoatl was going to return on great white birds. Well, the natives, when they saw the ships coming with the big white sails, they looked like big white birds. So that was another thing. So Quetzalcoatl and the other elites, basically they had this very fatalistic view of, like, not only this, but all these other signs were happening too. So they basically said, there's nothing we can do about this. And that was part of the reason that there were some significant battles that went on, but, for them to, in the face of such overwhelming numbers, be able to defeat the Aztecs in 2 years, that was basically the rulers had kind of laid down and fatalistically said, yep, that's our lot in life. So anyhow, so the other thing that was going on after this is there was some of the conquistadors were very greedy, if you will, and were driven by gold and land, and that was basically what set them up in opposition to the Franciscans. And one of them in particular was this Nuno de Guzman, and he looked at the natives as subhuman, and that really justified how he could treat them. The Franciscans were trying to advocate for the natives, but they were actively opposed by the civil authority. This first audience is what the government that had been set up in this New Spain was. So King Charles started hearing stories of this, and so he sent Bishop Zumarraga, who was supposed to be, his main role was to be the protector of the Indians, but he had a little bit of a problem in that he hadn't been actually ordained as a full bishop yet, so his sway with the Franciscans was not as great as it might have been. He was eventually, I think, ordained as a bishop in 1533. But the other part of it is he was also supposed to have civil responsibilities, but what the First Audience organization would do was every time he tried to send a note back to King Charles, they would intercept it. So he couldn't get any news back to King Charles as to what was really going on. So by 1531, the natives were saying, we thought this was going to be an era of peace and prosperity, and now the conquistadors, the Spaniards, were treating them almost as bad as the Aztec, the rulers had been treating them. So they were starting to say, well, there's more of us than there are of you, and, we're going to kind of rectify the situation here. So Zumarraga knew that, things were getting bad, and he was kind of in a bad place, because if he made the conquistadors too mad, they'd actually killed a few people as traitors, said, you're treasonous, and so they killed him. So he was trying to not go that route. And he also wanted to, the Indians knew that he was supposed to be the protector of them. So, he was trying to also, act in good faith there. So anyhow, so he was kind of in a bad place. So he, on the December 8th of 1531, he actually did find a way to smuggle a note out to King Charles. It was, I think, sealed in the wax of a cask or something and sent. Took a while to get to him, but it's notable that December 8th is when he sent it out. And in the note he said, unless there is supernatural help, the country is lost. So that was his take on it. So that gives you a little bit of the kind of the context of what was going on leading up to the actual appearances of Mary. So anyhow, so the basic story is, and this is condensing a lot into a very short version, but so Mary appears to Juan Diego, and he has an uncle, Juan Bernardino, and she appears to them 5 separate times between December 8th and December 12th of 1531. And one of the things that's kind of interesting in all this, there's some celestial stuff that is coming in a few slides here. And when you look up, like, when the winter solstice is, that's an important date in all of this. And you see that it's on a certain date in here. It was actually, they were working off of the Julian calendar rather than the Gregorian calendar. So there was an offset of about 2 weeks at the time. So there's a cool website you can go to. You can say, tell me what date it is or what day of the week it was in a given year. So I did that with 1531. And so you can get the day and the actual Gregorian day that it would be too. So anyhow, all kinds of fun things you get to figure out. And then, so she appears to them 5 times, and these apparitions occur at this place called Tepeyac Hill, which is just outside of Mexico City. And actually, I think now it's in Mexico City. And it's interesting to note that on that same hill, prior to these apparitions, there had been a shrine, an Aztec shrine to this goddess Tenitzin, and she was the mother of all the gods. And the idea was that every morning she would birth the sun god, and he would, do his course through the sky. But she also had other children, and if they didn't measure up, she would kill them. So she was a mother, but she was also murderous. So anyhow, yeah, murder and mayhem everywhere you turned. But anyhow, so they the Aztecs had a shrine to her that they sacrificed people on at the top of Tepeyac Hill. But when the conquistadors arrived, they destroyed that temple. So there were the ruins of this temple that were up there. And then on the last day of December 8th to 12th is when this miraculous image is formed on Juan Diego's tilma. All right, so here's where we crunch a whole bunch of stuff into a few minutes. So on December 8th, Bishop Zumarraga wrote that note, and then and it's also interesting to note that that was Vespers of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception that year. And so he sent that letter off, and then essentially, I think it was in his diary, they've got some of his writings. Essentially, he was praying fervently for God's intervention. And he had a devotion, a strong devotion to Mary, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, how the Spanish had a very strong devotion to an icon in Spain that was called Our Lady of Guadalupe. But the history, that name actually came from a location that's in Spain. And there's a very interesting story that goes with that. It was actually a statue, I've got a picture of it, that supposedly St. Luke carved. And it ended up being passed around, but it ended up in Spain. And when the Muslims attacked at one point, they moved it out of Spain in like the 600s or 700s, 717, I think. And it got moved to the north of Spain and buried, and it stayed buried for 600 years until this poor shepherd was out looking for a cow, and Mary appeared to him and said, "Dig here." And anyhow, they built a shrine when they found this icon, and so King Charles had prayed at this shrine, and Christopher Columbus had prayed at this shrine before he came to the New World. And so all the Franciscans and all the royalty would have known about Our Lady of Guadalupe, but they knew of it as this icon or this statue that came from Spain, and had that history of being tied to St. Luke. But anyhow, so Bishop Zumarraga actually had in his office a picture that was of Mary, and it was something that had been on a standard that Cortez had carried with him when he landed. So, and I have a picture of it at the end. If we have time, I can show it to you. It actually ends up looking very familiar to the tilma Mary. But anyhow, so Juan Diego, on December 9th, which is the next day, Saturday, which is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. This is a 57-year-old Chichimecan Indian, and his Indian name was Coahutzloatzin, which means speaking eagle in Nahuatl. And he is walking 9 miles to the catechetical class which just outside of Mexico City. So Father Andre, you need to tell all your students that, if they aren't willing to walk 9 miles to faith formation, that they're not living up to the standard. But anyhow, he's on his way. He goes by this Tepeyac Hill, so you can see in the thing here. He lived up here with his uncle in this Toplatco, anyhow, but he would walk 9 miles down to Mexico City to go to Mass and once a week for his catechism lessons. So he's on his way, and Mary appears to him as he's going by the hill here. He hears this wonderful music, and actually that music that you heard when you came in, that is music that is embedded in the tilma, and they think that might be the music that Juan was hearing when he walked by Tepeyac Hill. But anyhow, so he went to the top of the hill, and Mary appears to him, and that's when she talked to him and said, "Know for certain, dearest of my sons, that I am the perfect and perpetual Virgin Mary, Mother of the true God, through whom everything lives, the Lord of all things, who is master of heaven and earth. I ardently desire a teocalli, a temple, to be built here for me, where I will show and offer my love, my compassion, and my help, and my protection to the people. Go to the house of the Bishop of Mexico City and tell him that I sent you, and that it is my desire to have a teocalli built here. Tell him all that you have seen and heard. Be assured that I shall be very grateful and will reward you for doing diligently what I have asked of you." So Juan is kind of gobsmacked by that, but he dutifully heads off for Mexico City, and he walks to the bishop's house and asks for an audience. And so he's a nobody, and given the background of what's going on in Mexico, Zumarraga's got his hands full. And so he eventually sees Juan, which to me is pretty amazing. Speaks to, I think, maybe who he actually was as far as, being an advocate for the Indians. But anyhow, so Zumarraga listens to him, and he says, "Okay, I hear what you're saying, but, this is kind of an incredible story. Let me think about it and come back later." And so Juan feels pretty defeated. He walks back to Mary, and Mary appears to him the second time on his way back then, and she says, he says, "You better find somebody more important than me, because the bishop's not going to listen to a little nobody like me." And Mary pretty clearly says, "No, it's you. You need to go back tomorrow and tell him again. Be insistent this time." And in the Aztec culture, Juan Diego, actually, when he was born, lived until he was 13 under the Aztec rule. So he saw what happened to people who disobeyed or got crossways with the Aztecs. They got carted off to the temple and got their heart chopped out. So he had that in his head as, don't disappoint people of authority. So anyhow, so when he told her that he hadn't been able to fulfill the mission, he was devastated. But she, insisted. So the next day he goes back, and Zumarraga says, "Okay, this is interesting, and the fact that you're back tells me that there's probably something going on here, but you need to come up with some proof as to how can I know that this is really what you're telling me." So that was December 10th. So then on the way home, Mary appears to Juan again, and he relays the story. "I need some proof. You got to help me come up with some proof." And she says, "Okay, come back tomorrow morning, and I'll have something for you," which would be December 11th. And when he gets home, his uncle that he's living with, his wife had died 2 years before, and where he lived was way up over here. Since where his uncle lived was closer to Mass and to where the catechetical classes were, he moved in with his uncle. And so anyhow, so he went home to his uncle's house, and he found that his uncle was sick. And not just sick, but there was a fever that people knew was generally fatal. And actually, there's an interesting story that in some of the books that there's actually a tradition that there were some questions about his uncle having this fever and kind of the time frame that he was going to essentially die in. And they think what actually might have happened was that there was a little bit of a skirmish in this town where Juan's uncle, since he was one of the Indians who had converted to Catholicism, some of the other Indians that hadn't converted looked at them as kind of traitors or the enemy, and there might have been a little skirmish that went on, and his uncle actually received like an arrow wound and was suffering from that because there was a little shrine there that was erected to him and it had some information on it, and it was buried for a lot of years, and then, I forget the exact year, but there was an earthquake, and essentially this thing was exposed, and they found it, and now it gave some credence to that other story. But anyhow, that's why when you read this stuff, it reads like a 24 episode or two. But anyhow, so Juan that next day, since his uncle is, deathly sick, he skips the appointment with Mary and to minister to his uncle. And then finally on the 12th of December, this evening of the 11th, his uncle Juan Bernardino says, look, I'm done. This is it. You need to go get a priest because I need, last rites, and I need confession. So Juan dutifully the next morning trucks off to walk back to Mexico City, but he tries to walk around Tepeyac Hill, take a different path, so he doesn't have to, explain himself why he missed the day before. But Mary comes to him anyhow and says, "Hey, what's going on?" And so she already knew, but so she says, "Look, don't worry about it. I've taken care of your uncle. I cured him. He's good." And Juan's like, "Oh, cool." So anyhow, so she goes, "Go to the top of the hill, and your sign will be there. There will be some flowers there for you to pick, and bring them down to me." And so he goes to the top of the hill, finds these beautiful flowers, and some of which are Castilian roses, which are not native to Mexico. They're from Spain. And it turns out that Bishop Zumarraga was a bit of I don't know if a botanist or something, but he loved Castilian roses. So anyhow, so there was a kind of a supernatural connection there. But so Juan goes up, finds these flowers, loads his tilma, brings them down. Mary says, "Okay, let me arrange them for you." She organizes them in his tilma, and then she gives him strict orders. Don't let anybody see what's in your tilma until you're with the bishop, So, and at the same time that she was with him, she had also appeared to Juan Bernardino and cured him. And when she was addressing Juan Diego, she would say, "I am the Blessed Virgin Mary." She never used the term Guadalupe, Our Lady of Guadalupe, to Juan Diego, but she did tell it to Juan Bernardino. That's how she announced herself to him, and that was significant, and it was part of what made this so impactful to the natives, is that if somebody like that came to two people, an older person and a younger person, it was respectful to give the information or communicate to the older person. So to the Indians, when they heard this story that she had announced herself as Our Lady of Guadalupe to Juan Bernardino, that fit with that being respectful and that cultural norm. So that was something that made this, it's just layer after layer of things that, Mary either did or left on the tilma, or, how Juan Diego responded. That really, it was not just the picture on the cloth that ended up being the impactful thing. It was just the whole puzzle. So anyhow, so Juan takes these flowers now, actually, takes these flowers, and he goes back to visit Bishop Zumarraga, and his attendants were trying to see what was in the tilma, and Juan was trying to prevent him from doing it, and finally one of them lifted a corner and saw the flowers, and what happened with the flowers, the physical flowers, when they tried to grab them, the flowers would disappear, but they would look like they then were a part of the tilma, like they were embroidered on the tilma. And it kind of freaked the attendants out, because they also were afraid of witches and sorcery. So they ran in to tell the bishop, "Hey, something really bizarre is going on out here. You need to take a look at this." So they kind of interrupted whatever he had going on. So anyhow, Juan goes in, and then you have the scene where he opens the tilma, and the flowers fall out, and the bishop and then all the people in the room fall to their knees, and Juan's like, What? It's just flowers. And then he looks down and he sees that the image had appeared at the exact instant that he had opened it up. So that was the kind of the Reader's Digest version of that. And then Zumarraga, when he saw that there were Castilian roses and the image and he had been, praying so fervently for, some kind of supernatural intervention. He knew that this somehow was part of the answer to the question of, resolving what was going on in Mexico. So, or as far as the unrest. So that is the story of the basic story of the tilma, or how it came to be. Let's talk about the symbols and the messages. So the symbols, it turns out that, like I mentioned earlier, the tilma has images on it that are very meaningful to the Aztec, to the natives. It was also, all the Christians looked at it and could identify things that were meaningful to them. And then the third one there is this: there were things in the tilma that at the time nobody knew about. You couldn't see them. You needed either technology that didn't exist at the time to see it, or it was kind of messages that were left for later generations. So anyhow, that's the kind of the three things. So the Aztec Codex, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these. I'll point out a few of them, and like I said, the slides will be online, and you can go read some of these. But I mean, so the Aztecs were impressed by she didn't have a mask on her face. That was a sign that she's human and not a goddess. The other thing was she looked like she was a mestiza, which was somebody who would be have a mixed parentage, so would have been an indigenous person and somebody from Spain. So the Indians took that as, hey, here's somebody who's unifying. This is for, everybody. And then they were a little bit confused by, she had loose hair, which meant she was a virgin, but this black band on her waist meant that she was pregnant. So they're like, what, a pregnant virgin? But then they had been catechized, the Franciscans, had been telling them that, Jesus was born of a virgin mother. So now there were started to be some connections with what, the Christians, the evangelization had been done. And then, she's standing in front of the sun. The Aztecs, the sun god was the most powerful god, so she's more important than that. The color of her mantle is this royal blue. That was reserved for, the king, Montezuma. Nobody else could wear that royal blue. It had stars on it that meant she was of heaven. Her tunic was pink, which was represented the earth. It had flowers on it. She's standing on the moon. There's a moon god also. There was a god for everything, but she was more powerful than the moon. And then the other thing that the priests, the Aztec priests, would have recognized the pattern of the stars on the mantle, and so we'll talk more about that in a second. But so they would have recognized that there was significance to the arrangement of the stars on the mantle, and then they also things like there's a very specific flower that was right over her womb. It was a quincunx flower, and that meant royalty and divinity and life. So they recognize that she's pregnant and the child that she carries is divine. So that's just page 1. There's page 2 of all the things in the Aztec Codex, and there were even other things that I don't have on here, but things like the fact that it was on a tilma. The Indians, when they would bring their babies to the temple to be, I guess, blessed after they were born, they would be wrapped up in a tilma, so that would be how they would be presented. So that also, had significance to the Indians. So anyhow, it's just incredible when you look at the amount of information that's in there. Oh, the other thing is the angel that's lifting Mary up. It looks like Juan Diego. And it's got eagle's wings, and Juan Diego's Indian name means speaking like an eagle. So yeah, it's incredible when you go look at the whole list of things. So that was the Aztec Codex. So as far as the Christians go, Guadalupe, when they heard Guadalupe, this is what they were thinking. So this was the statue that St. Luke supposedly carved that was buried. And this was in the shrine in Spain. and had been venerated, by King Charles and actually Isabella and Ferdinand before him had, venerated or been to this shrine. But this was the name that was revealed. Our Lady of Guadalupe was the name that was revealed to Juan Bernardino. So later on, when they went to from Zumarraga's place to pick up Juan Bernardino, and he revealed what had happened to him, and he said this name, the Spaniards were like, what? Guadalupe? And there's a little bit of a controversy about this, that depending on which author you read, there's also a term in Nahuatl, and I'm not even going to try and say it, but it basically means she who crushes the head of the snake. And the Quetzalcoatl was the feathered serpent. So this evil god Quetzalcoatl was the feathered serpent. So some Indians, when they heard Guadalupe, it's phonetically very similar to this Nahuatl word that means she who crushes the head of the snake. So that also was significant to them, that they said, oh, this is the woman who crushes the head of our god, the serpent. But that was not really what was, the way it was presented. So anyhow, the other thing that happened in here was the, let's see here. So the other thing was in Spain when this icon was found. It was found at the end of the time, really, when the Moors were finally being run out of Spain. So, that was not that necessarily Mary was intervened in that, but the Spaniards associated that with this is now a time finally when, Spain was all Catholic and it was a unified state. So when they saw that, this is the same thing they were trying to do in Mexico, that had some significance also. So just a few of the things that were consistent with the Christian iconography is the shape of this is a mandorla, which is, what you see in a lot of iconography. It's an almond shape, and that means it's called the Vesica Piscis, and it depicts the sacred moments that transcend time and space. So that was significant to, Christian iconographers. And again, some of the things like the mantle color, has a similar meaning to what it did to the Aztecs. And the moon under her feet, people, read into that Revelations 12:1, which is allusion to the, Mary and the apocalypse. So that had the significance for that. One thing that I thought was very interesting in this, again, her hands folded in prayer, the sash, right here, if you look, this shadow, it looks like Christ on the cross. And so people saw that and they're like, whoa, okay. So so it was just kind of one of those, it's not like in your face, but very definitely it's there. And then the other things too that were interesting is that the Christians looked at this, and Juan is the Spanish version of John, and John is depicted as an eagle in Scripture. So that was an association that the Franciscans were getting out of this. And then the other part of his name, Juan Diego, the Franciscans were very familiar with Saint Diego of Alcala. He was 1400 to 1463, and part of the tradition with him is that he was taking food from the monastery and giving it to the poor. And one day when he was going out of the monastery with food in his cape, hiding it, the head of the monastery, or the abbot, said, what do you got in your cape there? And because they knew he was taking food out and they were trying to catch him at it, and he opened up his cape and flowers fell out. So the Franciscans that were in the room at the time when they saw that event of the tilma and the flowers coming out and the fact that it was Juan Diego, they were like, wow. Anyhow, so that was another one of those really, really interesting parallels. But anyhow, so as far as the science, the codex, so the things that we'll talk about here in a second are their images actually in her eyes, reflections that are in her eyes that the scientists didn't see until very recently. There's also this celestial information that the Aztec priests kind of knew about, but there's a software program called, I think it's Redshift, and if you put in a date and a location, it will show you what the stars are on that date. And if you put December 12th, 1531 at 6:45 a.m. in there, and you put that you're in the sky above Tepeyac Hill, the stars that you see are exactly in the order that they are on the tilma. So anyhow, there's geographic information on her tunic. We'll talk about that in a second. And then music, and that music that you were hearing when you came in, that's actually music that was transcribed off of the arrangement of the flowers and the stars on her tilma. And then there's some other stuff that I didn't even have a chance to really get into the presentation because we'd be here for days. But anyhow, so that is kind of a high level of what the scientific codex was, but let's just go talk about the science now. So again, small print, but between 1633 and 2006, there have been 17 separate studies that have been done on the tilma. And the one thing I noticed in here is a lot of them were actually Mexican origin. There's a German chemist that got involved here, and then in this group of studies by ophthalmologists, there's a guy from, I think, New York or New Jersey who discovered some stuff in there. But anyhow, it's been studied extensively. And one of the most interesting one is the eyes. And in the eyes, I don't know if you can see down here at the bottom, but this guy who was this ophthalmologist from New Jersey, he demonstrated this phenomenon by taking a picture of his daughter. And you can see in her eyes the reflection. This is a real photograph. You can see a real reflection of people that are in the room where she's looking. And this is her left eye, and this is her right eye. And so you can see the reflection here is a little different than the reflection in that eye. And it's a function of the, just the geometry of where your eye is relative to what you're looking at. But so those reflections are something, and it's not that it just reflects on the outer layer of your eye. There's actually a reflection at each, like at the outer layer of the cornea, like the inner layer. On the lens, there's a reflection. You get a little reflection off of that. And then in the retina. So an ophthalmologist, when they look in your eye with that ophthalmoscope, they actually they expect to see those reflections at the different layers in your eye to different degrees. And when these ophthalmologists looked at Mary's eyes in the image with their ophthalmoscope, it said they felt like they were looking in a real eye based on those different layers of reflection. So it wasn't just the reflection that was on that outer layer. And it kind of, that image right there kind of shows you a little bit. And it's actually called the Perkine-Sanson effect. And the images in Mary's eyes had 98% conformity with the optical laws that are, basically the physics of the light entering your eye. So this is an actual, blow up of kind of her eyes. And this, her left eye, this is a blow up of it. And you can kind of see that on this side right here, there's a seated figure, and it was an Indian, and he's holding some kind of an instrument. This right here, this head right here is Bishop Zumarraga. This head right here is his translator. Right here, there's a family of 6, and they think that Bishop Zumarraga was doing a baptism at the time, and there was a family of 6 people in there. This little triangle right here, that's the hat on one of the members of the family, like the dad or something. This right up here, Bishop Zumarraga had my arrows didn't come through very well, but he had a black servant. And so that was his black servant there. And then up in here, there was another woman who was another other unidentified woman. And then if you did this same blow up from her other eye, you can see Juan Diego in there in the corner of his tilma. And they said that based on these reflections in Mary's eyes, that it's like she was actually present in the room, but standing next to Bishop Zumarraga watching Juan Diego open up his tilma. So the reflection actually is like she was in the room, but not on the tilma, but back away. So yeah, it's just, when you read this stuff, it's unbelievable. So anyhow, but there were 13 people total that they can discern in this image. And there was one thing that I read that I kind of have trouble believing, but there's scientists who claim this, but apparently in the eye of this Bishop Zumarraga, so in this image in her eye, and by the way, this iris is only 5/16 of an inch. So on the tilma, that is 5/16 of an inch. So all of this is in 5/16 of an inch. So they said there's no way anybody could have faked this in terms of being able to paint that level of detail that fine. So, they said in the eye of Bishop Zumarraga, when they zoom in with even higher powered magnification, they said they can actually see indications that there might be in his eye a reflection of Juan Diego in some of what he would be looking at in terms of, what Bishop Zumarraga was looking at. So anyhow, unbelievable. All right, so the celestial information that's on it, the tilma, this is kind of shows you a graphic of where the stars are in which constellations, and again, it's kind of hard to read, but essentially it's the stars match the constellations at 6:45 and as viewed from space, or another way to think about it, it's a mirror image of what is seen when you look up at the sky, or the way the Aztecs did their astronomy or looked at the sky was they would find a very still pool of water, and they would look at the sky, the reflections in the pool of water, because they could put a stick or something fixed in the water, and they could track the motions of the stars better that way than trying to lay on their back or something and hold the finger up and track it. So they said, when you look at it in a pool of water, it's the mirror image, it's the reflection. So what was on her tilma, that's why the priests would have recognized it as being representative of what was in the sky. And it's actually 46 of the brightest stars in the Mexican night sky are present. And then what's even more interesting is that some of these weren't visible on the tilma. Like this constellation up here, it's called the Boreal Crown, but it's actually where a crown on the head of Mary would be as the Queen of Heaven. And then the same thing with Leo the lion. It was over her womb, and that wouldn't have been. And then Virgo would have been where her hands were clasped as if, as she was praying. So the locations of those stars or those constellations matched up with, some physical characteristics or attributes of the thing. So, and the other thing was this actually happened on the winter solstice. And so the symbolism to the natives was that from that morning on, or from that day on, it meant new life. The days were getting longer. So this is what you're talking about, the constellations that weren't visible. The other thing was the stars on her upper left arm, so right here, look like a rosary. The Southern Cross is the cross, and then that constellation is like the rosary, the beads. So anyhow, cool, huh? Okay, the other thing that was on the tilma was volcanoes, and the way the flowers on her tunic are. When somebody figured this out, they laid it down and matched it up, and they took this volcano called Cerro de la Estrella, and it's the Star Mountain, and they put that over the quincunx flower on her womb, and then all these other volcanoes lined up. So essentially, it was the arrangement of the flowers matched up with the surrounding volcanoes in Mexico. And then that Star Mountain was used by the Aztec priests to observe every morning. When the sun came up, they'd light a fire and say, okay, we're good to go. The sun god had enough blood, so he's ready to go. And then now, every Good Friday, Stations of the Cross is celebrated on the summit of that mountain. So, Okay, so this one's kind of interesting. This same professor who did the volcano thing, he said, he's a mathematician, and he said, in math, there's connections to, how do you have it? It's math, music, nature, and stars. And he said, so we figured out the stars, we figured out nature of the volcanoes, and he found some math stuff in it. He goes, I wonder if there's music in this. So it was like the four sides of a square. And so he took the stars and the flowers of the tilma and considered them as notes. He basically laid out a piano keyboard that, coincided with that. And the result, when he did that and he played it, is what you guys were listening to. It's not this part. What they did was they took and they layered in some kind of supporting music, but it was when it starts sounding like the organ. So that is what you get if you play the notes on the tilma. I don't know about you guys, but that gives me goosebumps. So this is a 1 hour loop if you want to listen to it. But anyhow, and what he did then too, just to kind of check himself, he said, okay, what if instead of taking the star arrangement at 6:45 a.m. on December 12th, what if I took it at 6:50 a.m. and looked at the star arrangement, and I laid it on here, what would it be? And he said it was very discordant. It didn't make sense. Musically, it didn't make sense. Or the other thing he did was there have been a number of replicas painted of the tilma, and so he took some of the artists who had thought they copied it, and he took their positions of their flowers and stars, and he did the same thing, and it was discordant. It didn't make sense. Didn't make musical sense. So anyhow, so there's something very specific about the exact location of all those things at the exact time, So the conclusions of the scientific studies were that this image is similar in nature to the Shroud of Turin in that it's Acarapetus. There we go. By the way, this word is not in Webster. You have to go to an old English or not even English, Latin dictionary to find it. So anyhow, but it means it's not made by human hands. And again, with the image, the basis for the colors is not known. Some of it has to do with refraction, iridescence, but there's no known pigments that when they did an analysis that found that. And then the way it was formed, the technique is unknown. There's no brush strokes. There's no provisional sketch that they can detect in this. So they said it was like it was formed as a Kodak picture. It was like it just zapped. It happened. And again, the star positions match the date. The flower positions match the volcanoes. The images in the eyes, they behave as you would expect, real reflections in the eyes. And they capture the scene the moment that Juan Diego opened his tilma. So it was like a picture of that moment that Juan Diego opened his tilma. The other thing that scientific studies thought was that the preservation of this fabric is totally unexplained. It's 492 years old. Agave only lasts 10 to 20 under the most careful storage conditions. The environment it was in for the first 115 years certainly would have destroyed it. All this physical contact, should have left some marks and damaged it, but it doesn't seem to show any signs of that wear. And then this nitric acid and the bomb blast, neither of those things did anything to it either. So there's certainly something out of the ordinary about that. So anyhow, so that's the science. So just a few closing thoughts for you. So that one book that I used, it's by Francis Johnston. He does a really nice job of saying, here was this bloody culture, and this one icon changed it. Mary interceded, left this message that was significant to the Aztecs and to the Christians, and they essentially forged one country out of it. And there's also some cultural aspects to this, in that if you look at how Mexico evolved and treated indigenous people versus how North America did, it worked much better for Mexico. The indigenous people ended up in a much better place in Mexico than the American Indians did. There's a whole section in one of the books on that, and the thought is that this image of Mary, had all these elements that really suggested that the two cultures needed to be one culture, and this image applied to both of them. So that was a significant part of it. But as far as parallels with today, this was a time of great change. It was a change of age. I think I was at, it might have been Fulton Sheen who said, we don't live in an age of change. We're living in a change of age. We're going from Christendom to something different. So, Mexico is with, having practiced this certain manner of religion and society for a, long time. Now all of a sudden it was being replaced. So it was a time of upheaval and change. And currently, what we're going through this with rapid technological changes, it's affecting culture and religion in ways that we're all, I think, we don't even begin to understand. So there's a parallel there. There's also a time of great expectation. The indigenous people were saying, wow, these prophecies have been fulfilled. We're supposed to be in a time of peace and, no more human sacrifice, but the promise wasn't being necessarily lived up to. And currently, I think, similarly, there's a belief that science is going to solve all our problems, and it's going to lead to this new, nirvana or time of peace and happiness. But I think we probably all know that is fraught with problems. A time of great unrest, that reality of the life under the Spanish rule and not the peace expected, so people were unhappy with that. And I think currently, we're seeing that same thing: technology, politics, religious, natural disasters, social media, economic. It's all feels like, what the heck? So great unrest now, like then. There's turmoil in the church in Mexico. So I didn't mention this, but, the Reformation started in 1517, so 1519 is when Cortez showed up in Mexico. So part of what Zumarraga was dealing with was also amongst his friars and the missionaries in Mexico, a little bit of the Reformation had bled over apparently into that. And so he was dealing with some unrest that way, trying to, tamp down anybody who was out, talking like the Luther. And then also there was a bit of a battle going on between Franciscans and Dominicans. The Franciscans were all in on this tilma and how it spoke to the indigenous people and being able to use that to bring people to God. And the Dominicans were saying, oh, no, we can't let the any element of the paganism, into the church. That'll wreck things. So anyhow, so there was some infighting going on there that Zumarraga was having to deal with. But anyhow, so currently, we've got schism, we've got, the German church doing what it's doing, and we've got, all kinds of heresy, declining affiliation, there's scandal, persecution, there's all kinds of, fun stuff going on. So turmoil in the church. Few converts to Christianity in Mexico before this tilma happened. The missionaries were having a heck of a time getting people to convert, and a large part of that was because the way the conquistadors were behaving, it poisoned the well, so to speak. The Indians were looking, well, you say this, but look how people behave. And then, currently we've got scandal in the church and secularism going on. So there's, people are, if they're not leaving, they're certainly, not converting. So, and then the church and the state were at odds, So again, the secular authorities were, saying, well, the natives aren't fully human. And then the church was saying, no, they are. We need to evangelize them. And that was, creating some serious problems. And then, currently, right now, it's the secular world seems to be getting pretty intolerant of, people of faith. So, this one almost goes without saying. A lot of what was happening in Mexico was the pursuit of wealth, and it was creating of the much larger, the indigenous population. And then currently you've got materialism and scientism are pursued in the face of, obviously, well, to some of us it seems to be obvious that some of these things are going to end in a bad way for humans, but, there are a lot of people who pursue it anyhow. And then Zumarraga was on his knees praying his heart out because, there was not a way out of this one that he could see. And currently, I think, and everyone was fighting everyone. And I mean, if you look around now, it kind of feels the same, right? Everybody's fighting everyone. And is there an off-ramp here anywhere? What do we do? How do we get out of this? So anyhow, with all of that, the solution for Mexico was Bishop Zumarraga. He was a man of strong faith, earnest prayer in the face of a desperate situation, and then he, intervention of Mary through a poor, devout agent who was insignificant by most secular standards. And then, but once that message came through, people followed it. Zumarraga in that one slide, so that was on the 12th of December. By the end of the year, they had the first temple built, or the first chapel built. So like within 2 weeks, they had that first chapel built, and the tilma was transferred there. So they didn't tarry. And then, so the question is, what do we do today? We need leaders of strong faith. We need to earnestly pray for God's assistance and intervention. Listen carefully for an answer from a place that will probably be insignificant by secular standards. And then once we get that message, we need to be obedient. And so the credits for this go to Dan the man. He's my research assistant. You can see he's got right there some books, prayers for healing, and this is Joseph, I think. So anyhow, so he was helping me. Any questions? That one's for you, Father Andre. Adrian?
So how did they know the interaction between Bishop and Juan Diego? Was it written down in the letters, or?
Which interaction specifically? You mean?
How did they know the specific interaction he had with Bishop?
So there were a bunch of different people. Tom's telling me to be done. Repeat the question. Okay. So for the people online, the question was, how did people know about the interaction between Juan Diego and Bishop Zumarraga? And so there were a number of witnesses, and there's actually a document that is traced back to, I forget the exact year, but it's called the Nican Mopwa. And it was a guy who, after this happened, the Franciscans started setting up universities in Mexico, and they had a very vibrant university setting. So somebody who had been an Indian, went to the university, was fluent in Nahuatl, and also learned English and I think Latin. But anyhow, he actually was able to interview Juan Diego, and he captured in this document a bunch of, almost direct quotes from Juan Diego. So a lot of it would have been based on Juan Diego's memory of what was going on there. And that was one thing, that's a good question, Adrian. There are a lot of skeptics of this, and a lot of it is based on that Zumarraga didn't leave any record of this. There's no record that he left of, yes, this happened. And they think that it was because of the political situation that he was in, because it didn't end with 1531 and the apparition. The politics of it, I was reading again another story online today, kind of cleaning some stuff up, and it's way more involved in terms of some of that fighting between, there was actually, King Charles sent that Nunez to curtail Cortez because they thought Cortez was getting too powerful, but then when Guzman, then when Guzman started going off the rails, then King Charles sent Bishop Zumarraga and called Guzman back to Spain, and he basically ended up a pariah. He was, thrown in jail, and, so, but anyhow, so a lot of it was based on documents and interviews of the first person interviews, so. Deacon?
The conversion of 6 to 9 million
Yeah,
Christians, how long did that take?
8 years.
8 years?
Yeah, they said that the missionaries, whole tribes would come into the mission churches, and the missionaries would get absolutely exhausted, from doing all the baptismal. Their arms would just be totally worn out. But it was 8 million people 9 million people in 8 years.
And is that considered kind of a record?
I think, yeah.
I mean, I've heard that it's been the greatest conversion.
Yeah. Well, and ironically, there were about that same number of people that were leaving in Europe through the Reformation. So it was like, when that happened in Europe, this happened, and a similar thing's going on now with people leaving the church in the Western world. Africa is seeing huge numbers of people coming into the church. So, Mike?
So there were all these discoveries that happened way after the fact, the stars, the geography, the music. Do you know, are there still researchers looking for more signs today?
So the question was, are there people looking for additional hidden messages in the tilma? And there is an organization that, in the one book I got, said there is this organization that's set up to continue the research. I went to their website, and there's not much going on right now. At least if it is, I missed it. So the short answer is yes, but I don't know how active it really is. So I don't think it's like the Shroud. The Shroud has annual conferences, and then there's always more stuff going on with the Shroud. So anyhow, Susie, did you have a question?
It was the same
As Deacon? Okay. All right. Well, I'm way past. I apologize for that, but thank you for coming. It was a fun lesson for me. I always learn more than the people who are on the receiving end, I think. So anyhow, so thank you. All right.